Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Learning and Work Institute event, the Apprenticeship Levy 5 years on. Thanks very much for joining us today. We've got a really great panel who I'll introduce shortly. And also thank you to NOCN for supporting the event and the Learning and Work report as well. My name is Bethan Staten. I'm the public policy reporter for the Financial Times. So I've been following the levy and Learning and Work's research into it quite closely. I'm sure some of you have managed to have a read about or a look at the recent report, which I found very illuminating and we'll be discussing later. And I sort of particularly have valued the focus on employer investment, the kind of critique of the government's following of employer decisions in skills policy, rather than focusing on where perhaps employers could be pushed to be more interventionist and to see kind of skills policy as more of a two-way street. I think that observation is particularly relevant to apprenticeships. I'm sure none of you will need any reminding of the difficulties that the apprenticeship levy has encountered in its 5 years in existence. We've seen a low number of starts, and I think most importantly, perhaps, and most interestingly, a kind of an imbalance in the types of people who are taking apprenticeships towards more senior members of staff, perhaps other than the younger workers that we would perhaps expect to benefit most from apprenticeships. There's plenty to talk about in the discussion. We've had some very big promises from the government on skills recently, including looking into the apprenticeship levy after a lot of excitement during the spring statement. We now know that there won't yet be a formal review, but there'll be some analysis and hopefully reform, and it does feel like a time of opportunity with lots going on in the skill space. However, still a lot of questions about the technical details of mechanisms like local skills initiatives, college hubs, and of course the kind of lifelong loan entitlement and what all this will mean for skills and adult training. We have plenty of time for a question and answer session at the end of the session. Participants who want to ask a question, you can pose questions throughout the event using Slido, and we're of course recording the event, and we'll share that in our follow-up along with a link to the report. So I will now pass on to Stephen Evans, the Chief Executive of the Learning and Work Institute, who's going to take us through some of the findings of the report and start up the discussion. So Stephen, I'll hand over to you. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks Bethan, and thank you for chairing today's event, and looking forward to hearing from our expert speakers shortly as well, and lots of Q&A time as well. What I thought I'd do is just introduce a little bit about what we've looked into, what we found, and what we're suggesting should happen as a result. And it's perhaps worth saying why this matters first. Lots of the debates in the news at the moment are about cost of living crisis, living standards, and public services being short of money, or feeling they're short of money. And in large parts, not wholly, but in large parts, a lot of these problems derive from the fact that economic growth since 2008 has been, to use a technical term, rubbish, and far, far worse than in most of the post-war era. So actually, how do we restart economic growth? How do we get our economy going again? That's really key to improving living standards and making sure public services have got the money that they need. And we know that investment by employers, including in skills, is one of the critical parts of how we grow the economy, and yet has been a real challenge for decades and decades. So this really matters because it's about productivity, it's about growth, it's about business success, and that the impact of all of that on living standards and on investment in public services. So this is really critical, and I was pleased the Chancellor talked about it in the spring statement. Now, if we go on to the next slide, please. This kind of takes the starting point of what we think we ought to be aiming for. So what would be a measure of success of any reforms? And I think a lot of people's views about the Apprenticeship Levy as part of how we get employers to invest in skills, a lot of people's views about how it's going are basically defined by their own version of what they think the Apprenticeship Levy should be there for. And the government has never, to my knowledge, set out clearly what its measure of success is. What is it looking to achieve? I think originally the levy came in partly to rebalance how spending on apprenticeships was badged in the books, partly to help fund the 3 million target that the Conservative government at the time had for apprenticeship starts in England, and then partly to increase apprenticeship investment overall by employers. But we haven't really had these measures of success, so we've had a go ourselves. If the Chancellor's dialed in, he's free to take these. So what we've argued for is that policy should be seeking to try and get to 1 million or 1.2 million more people to get training at work by levelling up, to coin a phrase, the proportion of employees getting training at work to the level seen for graduates, because we've got this really stark inequality at the moment that I'll come on to. So we want to level up the proportion of people getting training, which would mean an extra 1.2 million getting training. Secondly, linked to that, we want to increase overall investment by employers in training by £6.5 billion a year, and that would get training spend per employee towards the EU average. At the moment, employers are investing half the EU average per employee. And then thirdly, it's not training for its own sake. This training has to benefit both people and employers. This shouldn't just be a numbers game. So these are our measures of what we think success might look like. So getting more people training because we're levelling up opportunity, getting more investment to close the gap with the EU average, and making sure that this training has an impact and not just doing it for its own sake. Challenge is we're some way off this at the moment, and the next slide starts to show why and how. So this chart shows shows basically the amount that employers invest in training each year. So this includes spending on courses, spending on training facilities, spending on the wages of people who are on training, the training of the wage costs of employees who are giving training as well. This is everything you could possibly measure, basically. And I think the key line here is the orange one. So this is the amounts that employers spend per employee on the right-hand side there. So you see back in 2005, we were about £2,100, something like that, per employee. And now 2019, which is the latest data that we have here, so pre-pandemic, we're down to £1,500 per employee. So that's a 28% fall over the course of 14 years or so. And as I said before, that figure today is half the EU average per employee. So investment per employee has declined and is way below the EU average. So if we look at the next slide, this gets to the point about inequality. So if you've got a degree level qualification, you are 3 times more likely to get training at work than if you've got no qualifications. And both those lines have basically gone nowhere over the last few years or so. So there's this really stark inequality that if you already have a decent level of qualifications, you're far more likely to get training at work. And if you look at that blue line, the proportion of no qualifications getting training in the last 13 weeks, it's gone nowhere. If anything, it's trending down. So we've not pushed that up at all. We've got a long way to go to level up that opportunity. This is basically a succession of depressing charts, but we will get into some more positive answers at the end, hopefully. So one more depressing chart, I think, coming up next. Oh, well, this is not depressing, sorry, it depends on your perspective. So that low level of investment by employers, and that stark inequality between different groups is despite about £6.8 billion every year of government support for employer training. So that's both in direct provision of courses through things like the adult education budget and European Social Fund and stuff like that. Also through the apprenticeship system and the traineeship system, and then also through the tax system as well. So this is the bit that gets remarked upon least, I think, quite often. So employers can deduct the cost of training from corporation tax bills, and we had a go at estimating what the cost of this might be. There are no official estimates. So the cost of the tax relief for firms and for the self-employed adds up to something like sort of 1.6 billion, might be a bit more, might be a bit less every year. That's a lot of money. That's more than the adult education budget, and yet we don't really talk about it. So we've got these stark inequalities and underinvestment compared to other countries, despite loads of government support or loads of government spending going into this area. And if we look at the next chart, we start to see a little bit about why. So this is my new favourite chart. I'm going to assume everyone's got a favourite chart. So the blue line here is the proportion of people who've got job-related training in the last 13 weeks. So this basically is flat at best. It's sort of trended down a little bit since 2004, and it's been flat for a decade or so. And the orange dots are the total amount that employers spend on off-the-job training, excluding wage costs. So it's a subset of that total employer investment I talked about before. And you can see that sort of bubbles around, going nowhere, basically. So these lines are flat, these dots are flat, and yet this is despite the government trying loads of stuff. So all of this text on here are different government initiatives that were trying to get employers to invest more in skills. And you can see some of them repeat themselves, like apprenticeship grant for employers crops up at least twice. I should have put actually aim to reduce qualification numbers in another couple of times as well, because there have been previous efforts to do that. So there's been lots of stuff going on, and yet these lines are going nowhere. So why is that? The next slide tries to give a bit of a diagnosis. Obviously, it's very complicated and there's lots and lots of stuff going on. This isn't the whole of the answer, but just to pick out 4 things I think are particularly important here. So the first is silos. So there's no point just focusing on how do we get employers more engaged in skills in and of itself, just on its own, thinking of skills in isolation. That's like pushing on a bit of string. The reason employers invest in skills is as part of their business strategies, part of trying to survive, part of trying to get new markets, part of trying to grow. And you need to see skills in that context rather than just on their own. And that applies at national government level as well. There's no point in the Department for Education just thinking, how do I get more employers to invest more in skills? Because actually it depends on how we're growing the economy, depends on our industrial strategy, it depends on how we're investing in infrastructure and a whole bunch of other things. That plan for growth, that go for growth approach across the board, it feels sometimes like we've slightly given up on economic growth and just accepted it is what it is, and we'll just have to suffer the consequences on living standards and public services. We don't have to do that, we can do better. But skills need to be a part of that, not sat on their own. Second, I think, is chop and change. So that previous chart that I showed, one of the really worrying things about that is that I ran out of space on the chart long before I ran out of initiatives to put on it. So it could have been far more cluttered. We just constantly chop and change these things all the time, and just change the acronyms without actually changing the reality, I think. So a bit of stability, I think, would be a very good thing. Third point is the purpose of policy. So initiatives kind of sometimes spring up and disappear without a sense of their purpose sometimes. So I made this point about the Apprenticeship Levy. We all have a view on how it's going, but that's based on our own view about what it should be doing, rather than a government who's come out and said, we're introducing this because, and here's how we'll measure its success. So what are we actually trying to achieve? That's why we put, or I put those measures of success right at the start when I started talking. That's my measure of success. Interested to hear other people's too. And then lastly, and I think this is for me one of the critical points, and one of the points we're trying to get across in the report, is that a lot of those initiatives on the previous slide were about how employers can steer the publicly funded system. So how can we make sure that the public funding delivers what employers want in terms of the groups of employers designing qualifications or designing apprenticeship standards or drawing up local skills improvement plans or this, that and the other. And the sort of if employers have been in more driving seats over the years than Lewis Hamilton, I think we've had lots of goes at this, and it is important because if you're going to invest public money in, and the bit of it that's focused on employer skills, it needs to meet employer needs, otherwise what's the point? But it can't just be about that. It needs to also be about how employers invest themselves beyond the publicly funded system and how employers use skills as well. So we need a much broader picture of some of this as well. I think the other point here, linking back to the purpose of policy, so when I was working on skills policy in central government earlier in the last decade, it was longer ago than I thought there for a moment, so it was a while ago, we were trying to increase employer investment in skills, but also trying to reduce those inequalities between groups so that those who had the least got the most, rather than the opposite, which is the case now. And yet policy now is increasingly passively following employer choice rather than seeking to provide a framework for how employers invest. So the corporation tax relief, more of that is going to training on highly skilled employees because that's what employers do more of and it costs more. The apprenticeship levy, more of that is going on already highly skilled employees and people further up the ladder rather than those lower down. And we need more of higher apprenticeships, but it shouldn't come at the expense of people who've got fewer qualifications or are just starting out. So I'd say policy needs to do more than passively follow choices. It needs to influence choice or provide a framework within which employers choose as well. So I think we've got a partial focus and we're not seeking to be clear about what policy is trying to achieve. So that's kind of my analysis. Interested to have others take on this, and there's lots more going on, I know, but this is a simplified version. So just moving on to the next slide, this is the last slide, and we tried to set out some ideas for how we can do things differently. I think one really important point is that you can't just list 5 things on a slide that are going to change 200 years of the path of capitalism in the UK. So I don't pretend that we've got all the answers here. These are ideas for how we can make things better. They're not the answer to all problems. So firstly, I do think we need new mechanisms for how we think about increasing employer investment in and use of skills as part of that overall plan for growth. So we've suggested part of that might be locally led skills and good work partnerships, so led by combined authorities, for example, or maybe the new local skills and improvement plans could contain commitments from employers about what extra they're going to do rather than just what they want from the publicly funded system. Secondly, we've argued for a skills tax credit so that small employers in particular could deduct 300% of the cost of training from their tax bills rather than just 100% as now. So this would mirror the research and development tax credit. There are examples of skills tax credits in other countries. To be fair, not lots of evaluation of their impact, so I don't want to overdo the evidence there, but we think that would be would help SMEs to invest in particular, and we've argued for a super skills credit rate, particularly in areas where we're focusing on for levelling up, and particularly for employers investing in essential skills like literacy and numeracy. So give employers more tax incentives, more financial incentives to invest in training. Thirdly, broaden the apprenticeship levy so that we allow investment in essential skills and other accredited qualifications. There's more to life than apprenticeships. They're really important, but there's more to life than apprenticeships. The quid pro quo of that, because if we widen it up, that means more of the levy is going to get spent by those larger firms. So the quid pro quo is we need to raise some more money somewhere. So that could be a higher rate paid by current employers, or it could be widening it to more employers. Lots of ways to plug that gap. And then fourthly, over time, we think there's a case for looking at replacing the levy altogether. This goes against my chop and change point. but replacing the levy with more of a tax-based system. So same sort of principles, but done through the tax system rather than money gets taken off firms, put in a digital account, and then they have to draw it down, or they have to pass it on to someone else who can draw it down. We risk creating quite a bureaucratic money go around if we're not careful. So are there simpler ways to do this to reduce bureaucracy? In fact, there's a war on red tape today, I think, announced by the government. There's kind of one every couple of years or so. So this could be a way to reduce red tape. And then lastly, it's not just about employers and what they do. How can we help people to learn and to retrain and to provide more rights for that? People do have a right to request time off for training, but not many people know about it. Not many people take it up, and it doesn't cover maintenance costs. So are there more things that we can think about there for individuals? So I hope that's kind of stimulated some thinking. We think this is a really important topic, and sometimes gets a bit skimmed over when we just talk about the levy and how it's working or not working. And we think there's a much broader picture here, and that's really the key part of the report. So very interested to hear the other speakers' views and also the questions coming through. And Bethan, I'll pass back to you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. That was great. A really good overview of the report. And as I said, I think that final point that you made about this being a really kind of important, different way of looking at skills policy that often gets sort of sidelined when we're thinking about publicly funded skills initiatives is really apt. I'm going to pass on to some of our panelists now. We've got 3 panelists, and I'm going to ask them just to sort of comment a little bit on the report itself, offer some reflections on the findings and the recommendations from also their kind of perspective in either industry or kind of training and so on. So I'm first of all going to ask Bhavina Bakada to speak. Bhavina is Head of Policy and Campaigns at Make UK. Yeah, go on. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here as well, and delighted to be part of this very, very important discussion. Whenever I speak to manufacturers about their top issue, the #1 thing that comes up is skills and accessing people. But before I start, as Bethan said, my name is Bhavina. I work as our Head of Policy and Campaigns at Make UK. For those of you who don't know, Make UK is the trade association for manufacturers. So we represent about 20,000 across the UK, from some of your largest manufacturers to some of your smallest. Make UK is a little bit different to other trade associations as well, in that we actually have a training centre in Birmingham where we train about 400 apprentices each year in a range of different engineering and manufacturing skills. So as I like to say, and other people who might have heard me say this, we don't just talk the talk, we walk the walk. And investing in people, investing in skills, particularly the next generation, is at the heart of what so much of manufacturers do. I agree with so much that Stephen has said, and in the slides, and both the report and the slides, I think it's really important that when we think about the skills challenges we face, is rethinking some of those incentives. A lot of what I hear from manufacturers is keep the status quo because they're just frustrated with so much policy change. But there are fundamental questions to be asked around, is this incentivizing the right behavior? Is it actually helping individuals? And crucially, is it helping that productivity problem that we have seen persistently over the last few decades? So what I wanted to share with you today is my reflections of the report, but also tying into kind of what we're seeing in our particular sector. I can't speak for all employers, but I will certainly speak for manufacturing employers in this particular area. So just to give you a bit of background, apprenticeships are the primary route for manufacturers to recruit young people. So about 8 in 10 manufacturers currently recruit an apprentice. But as you can imagine, during the pandemic, that fell to about 6 in 10. Now, we have lots of discussions about how we can encourage people to take on an apprentice or become an apprentice. But actually, the biggest challenge that a lot of manufacturers are facing is not actually recruitment during the pandemic, but actually it was retention. So how can I keep the people I've got in my business who have fantastic institutional knowledge, who have quite niche skills, keep them in my business to make sure that they don't leave and you lose those skills. So we made the point quite clearly to Treasury that actually the focus needs to be on how can we keep those people in the business, so focus on retention. And as a result, the apprenticeship incentive that was introduced by Treasury actually had a pretty low take up in our sector. In fact, 4 in 10 businesses said they wouldn't use it and didn't use it during the pandemic. And I think that ties into a point made in the report where financial incentives are not enough to drive the right behaviour. For manufacturers, it's really seeing how does this fit into my wider skills pipeline, progression, and then achieving what I need to achieve as a business. I think the other factor and the other trends that we're seeing within our particular sector, which also aligns with some things in the report, is that actually we're seeing this move towards level 4 and 5 skills, a demand for level 4 and 5 skills based on the fact that the industry is undergoing a digital and green transformation. So what's happening is manufacturers are rethinking, if I take someone at level 3, how do I make sure that they progress onto level 4 and 5? And that's where that policy offer needs to be a little bit clearer. And again, Stephen mentioned this again, where we had £6.8 billion worth of government support, a significant chunk of money, but we're not quite sure, particularly employers, what will help my business to achieve X, Y, Z. And I think that's where we can make the policy offer much clearer, much more obvious to manufacturers, but also businesses, so that we can use the existing pot. And I'm sure if there are Treasury officials on here, they will be happy to hear it's not about new money all the time. Sometimes it's about using existing funding better. I think there's just one thing I'd like to add around an area to watch, which hasn't been mentioned, which is we've seen achievement rates of apprenticeships really fall. So only 52% at the moment are completing their apprenticeship. That is like a silent crisis going on in the background. And we really, again, need to make sure that those people can access the training they need, can finish their apprenticeship, and that leads on to a good job. Because if you've undertaken that investment, it's really important that you can then get into the right employment and progress. What I would just say, and this, just to finish on, there are a couple of slightly longer term challenges. And I agree with Stephen, that chart is also my favorite chart. But policy churn for the last 10 years has been significant. And it's part of the reason why there is a real reluctance around changing the apprenticeship levy. And by saying that, I mean tearing it up and starting again. Some people want to keep it as it is because they just don't want to start again. But that's a ludicrous situation to be in. And I think we need to get away from that situation where we don't want churn, but actually move to a position where we have stability, but actually it works for employers and individuals. And then finally, my last point would be, we mentioned leveling up. Leveling up is just as much about people as it is place. And accessing skills and connecting people to opportunities is going to be vital. And the ecosystem behind that, connectivity, transport, all of those things are really, really crucial. So we can get colleges and education providers to work, we can get employers engaged, but if individuals can't access those opportunities because of physical barriers or transport barriers, there's an issue for local government to really intervene and fix that. So a whole host of issues. I hope that gives you the manufacturer's view and a few things that we can do, but also government in conjunction to fix some of those longer term challenges. So I'll hand back to you now, Bethan.
Thanks very much. Yeah, and I think a lot of those observations kind of tapped into a bigger question, I think, about how we develop policy around apprenticeships and skills more broadly. So the kind of importance of speaking and messaging, you know, well to employers in an effective way. Policy churn versus thinking very deeply about what we want to achieve and what the objectives are, and also that question of local services. The one thing that comes up so much when I speak to people is just the lack of kind of holistic thinking across government departments on this, and I think that's an area where there can be a great deal of improvement, and where we could see some sort of more effective decision making, perhaps, if that's taken into account. Thanks so much. I'm now going to ask Graham Hastings Evans to talk a little bit about his take on the report, and he's the Chief Executive of NOCN Group. We've also got some slides to accompany this. So Graham, please go on.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be able to speak this afternoon and for us to sponsor this excellent piece of work. Strengthening skills is the way to economic prosperity. So it's absolutely crucial that we make some progress and put behind us the issues of the last 30 years. And I know we can't quite do that, but we need to. Next, please. We do need to understand that we are in unprecedented times. We've still got the impact of COVID, and it will last for some years, as well as Brexit. Major changes in terms of digitization of jobs and greening of the economy, which means that a lot of the existing skills our workforce have are becoming outdated, sometimes quite rapidly. And we've got skills gaps at the operational levels. HGV drivers, hospitality, care, construction, etc. It's not all about high skills. In fact, some of our major challenges are at the level of what I like to consider the operational level. Don't like the use of the word lower skills level. I think that actually demeans the value of that type of occupation to the economy. As the report lays out, there's a decline in employers' investment in skills, which is disappointing to see. And we are, I think, sleepwalking into stagnation in skills. Next, please. I think we need to reflect on what is the needs of the economy and what do employers want. A number of the speakers, Stephen, has made these points, but what's interesting, I find, is what's coming out of the local skills improvement plans, and none of it for a shock. I used to work for the UK Commission of Employment Skills, been involved in employer engagement and economic regeneration in local government over a number of years. So this is not a shock. It needs to be simplified. It's too bureaucratic. We need to focus on upskilling, particularly for digitization and green. Employability skills, big issue across virtually all parts of the country. People want smaller courses and qualifications, a lot more flexibility. Training and training courses keeping up with the advancements in industry. That's really major challenge. And in doing that, you have to have tutors that are up to date to be able to teach these new skills. And unless we start to do that and simplify the system, we won't get the essential engagement that we need from more and more SMEs. Next, please. You look at the policy landscape. I'm not going to read out all of these things. These are just a few of the last few years to add to Steve's chart, although I know one or two of them are on there. That's just since 2013, enormous amount of policy change. But the one thing that seems to have eluded us, and I will talk about England because it's different in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. We have to accept devolution has made a change. There appears to be there's no documented national skills strategy. And that is part of the problem, why different government departments don't seem to talk to each other, why we haven't got a holistic position. And it's really difficult to see how all of the various initiatives fit together. We've had 30 years of good intentions with the policies. We want employers to be engaged. We want to make sure it supports industry, but we've never actually seemed to achieve that, unfortunately. And our current range of policies is very, very much focused, I believe, on young people and taking young people through the education system, school, onto college or sixth form college or university, higher education. And it's not really designed around the needs of the 32 million people that are in the workforce. It's been very narrowly focused along education lines and getting people into their first job rather than keeping them employed and upskilling them as is necessary for a vibrant economy. Next, please. And I think in that sense, the levy, I think we'll all wonder, what is the levy about? I come from a construction industry, so levies and apprenticeships have been around for years and years and years. But this particular levy perhaps not been explained that well, and has been very narrowly focused. And part of the problems around it have been that we've seen a decline in apprenticeship starts, but more importantly, there's not that many people with a new apprenticeship achievement certificate. Over the last 5 years, only around about 370,000 people have got one of these new super duper better quality apprenticeships, and they are better quality. I'm not knocking that at all. There's a lot of good done in terms of increasing the quality of the apprenticeships, but nevertheless, against a sort of target of 3 million starts, 370,000 completions in 5 years is not brilliant, because employers want people. So what comes out the other end of the sausage machine is the important figure, not necessarily how many start to go into the sausage machine. It's inflexible, it's bureaucratic. We have never solved the issue about who properly funds 16 to 19. If you move employers between employers in lots of sectors, that's not possible. So there's lots and lots of technical problems with the levy, as well as the fact it is so focused on just apprenticeships and narrowly defined apprenticeships by IFATE. And we've seen the skewing from the operational level apprenticeships to the higher level apprenticeships, and hence lo and behold, we've got skills gaps in the operational level. So quite a difficult set of problems. And this is not designed for upskilling of the workforce, unfortunately. Again, it's too focused on getting somebody into their first job. Next, please. So I think I welcome a lot of the proposals in the report, or the principles of them. The broadening of the apprenticeship levy, the skills and good work partnerships, the skills tax credit. I'd link into that a clearer understanding of career pathways, more effective programs like traineeships to get into pathways. And I think the traineeship and the boot camps are a help. More focus on employability skills and removing all of those barriers that people have talked about eloquently so far. And to do that, we need to modularize training and qualifications and standards so that we can upskill, because somebody that's 30 is not going to go back to school for 2 years to study a level 4 HTQ. What we've got to do is to take those type of people and give them the extra skills they now need beyond what they either got at school or college and they've got in the workplace. So a much more flexible and modularized approach to it all if we're going to make this work. And I've sort of reflected, I'm going to leave a question for people. And I've been reflecting on this. I'm reflecting on policy and where we're all going with this. And we've all talked about government departments don't seem to talk to each other. I think there's a fairly big question actually as to whose job this is. So who in Whitehall is the single policy owner for the development of skills needed in the workforce of 32 million? That matches all the requirements of upskilling, levelling up, regional economic development, net zero, digitisation and social mobility. Answers on a postcard to Graham Hastings Evans. It's an interesting question and I don't think we all really know the answer to it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Graham. And yeah, I think that is a super important question. One I'm quite familiar with actually when trying to get answers on some of these questions in reporting too. I'll finally hand over to Charlotte Bosworth, who's the Managing Director at Innovate Awarding, an awarding body. So Charlotte, go on.
You, Beth. I found the report quite fascinating from the perspective. It depends how you start with your initial view, and it made me reflect actually on one of the earlier points that Stephen made, is what actually was the purpose of the levy. And I've spent quite a bit of time going over previously published documents to see if I could find the answer to that, and actually it isn't written down anywhere. So I then kind of asked myself, so if the purpose of the levy was to have a higher volume of apprentices, if it was to have better success rates, if it was to have more 16 to 18-year-olds engaged in apprenticeships, then arguably the levy hasn't been successful. If we actually say it was about a high level of engagement in degree apprenticeships, more occupations actually covered by apprenticeships, and actually higher level of engagement by large employers, then arguably we could say the levy has been a success. But I don't think that's ever really been set down what the purpose of the levy was. However, when I was rereading some of the documents, I came across the Richard review, and it actually stipulated in there what should an apprenticeship be and how might that support the changing needs of our economy. And I think that's partly where everything started becoming confused, because we've just looked at apprenticeships in isolation instead of actually considering the overall skills agenda and what we're trying to achieve here. I was also startled that it stated it was just about the economy, because I would have always thought that our skills agenda and what we wanted to achieve was also about equity, access and participation as well. So I then jumped to start thinking, so what could the solution be here? And I agree with many before, we don't necessarily want to rip up and start again. We do want some stability in our system. But I think there's a deeper thought process here, which is maybe more around the culture of those that engage in our skills system. So not just apprenticeships, but our wider skills agenda here. So what is actually the culture needed within businesses to ensure that they invest in training within their own organisations? How do we create a culture in businesses where they don't necessarily just opt for the easiest route to get that skilled workforce? And this is falling into that equity, access and participation point. It's much easier to take on somebody who's worked within businesses, understands what it's like to be employed and has already got their literacy and numeracy than it is in employing a 16 to 18-year-old at the beginning of their journey who hasn't necessarily worked within an organisation before. The needs do change, and how do we make sure it isn't always just about the easiest route to having a skilled workforce? I think in all this, we talk very much around employers, but actually, how do we also create that culture so businesses and the system consider the skilling and competency of the individual? Yes, we want businesses to be able to benefit from that, but surely sometimes we should change the discussion to be about that skilled, competent individual rather than just the needs of the business. And then my final point that I want to make, just because I feel this has got lost quite a lot in the debate and discussion, is policy is sometimes leading our skills agenda at the moment. Very often we hear people within government agencies talk around the ambition for level 3, but actually the pathway shouldn't be dictated by policy. I've seen many skilled individuals at level 2. And surely this should be about the economy, but also about equity, access and participation as well. So I'll stop there, Bethan, and hand back to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Charlotte. And I'll now ask the rest of our panelists to come and join for a discussion about those contributions and the paper. Those of you in the audience, I'll remind you to please ask as many questions. We've already got plenty coming in, and I will refer back to them during the discussion. We've got some really interesting thoughts. I was wondering, I mean, to begin with, we've sort of come back a couple of times to this question of what the apprenticeship levy's aims should be. How do you think employers really see the kind of purpose of the levy now, and what do you think they sort of hope to gain from it? I was interested, Bhavina, particularly in you mentioned kind of retention being important to many of your members, and one thing that seems quite interesting about the kind of shift towards more senior members of staff is this being used in part as a kind of means to retain and motivate staff, to give them something extra, I suppose, as well, at different levels in their career. But I mean, what are employers kind of really looking for in the levy in practice, and how perhaps might that culture sort of change or develop in order to make better use of the funds?
I'll tackle the bit how they see it, which is, and they've seen it like this for years, is it's a tax. When it was introduced, we said to Treasury, it is a tax, don't call it a levy. So I think the mixed messaging again just didn't land. Like, if you were just honest to begin with and said it was a tax, I think it would have probably landed with businesses a little bit better. But there was immediately that kind of, oh, well, no, we're calling it a levy, but it's not really a levy, is it? But I think now we're in a position where manufacturing is slightly different in that we're not seeing that huge trend towards lots of people who are slightly older using the levy. There's still the vast majority see it as a route to bring in young people. So we're not seeing that transition to level 6 MBAs and things like that. Whereas I think in other sectors you probably are. And that's maybe what that particular subsector or sector needs, and that's completely fine. But I think for businesses and manufacturers specifically, now it is, how do I bring someone into my business, train them up to what I need, and then crucially, the progression bit. That's the bit that they're thinking about. It's really difficult, and we'll touch on it, I'm sure, later, to try and change the culture within not just our sector, but the entire workforce, that if you are 30, 40, 50, taking an apprenticeship is for you. You can do it too, when for so long in our sector, it has been a route into business. To change the mindset will be really, really difficult. And I think that's where we're seeing the challenge around upskilling and retraining. There's fantastic level 3 courses available, skills boot camps, but people in the workforce don't see it as, do I have to go back to school, or do I have to do it when I've got caring responsibilities? All those things become really difficult. And the commitment to do an apprenticeship in the manufacturing and engineering specialism is a significant commitment. Like, that's no easy thing to do. So all of those things can probably put people off, and fits into that wider issue around the culture of workforce training and lifelong learning. But what I would say is that we say this all the time, but I do genuinely think we've got an opportunity here. And Charlotte, I think you mentioned a little bit earlier that if we can have a period of stability, I think actually people will see there's all these fantastic options available to me. It doesn't matter if I'm 29 or 59, I can do it, and it will help me achieve different things in this business, and I can see a path to progression here. So not really an answer. What I would say is they see it as a tax. What they see it now is it's here to stay. It's not really going to change. So just make the most of it, really.
Pavina, I totally agree with you, and we've seen a very similar trend from our perspective, where originally there were a number of organisations who said we just want to find a way of claiming this tax back by having as many apprentices within our business. However, what we've seen over time, and this is where I ask that stability point, is that perception has changed by those organisations, and they now can see the benefit to their organisation of having apprentices, whether that be a new workforce or current workforce, being upskilled and trained, and that retention piece, and individuals feeling they're being valued and invested in actually has been a massive benefit. So I think we have seen a change over time where there was a lot of, I just want to do anything to claim this money back. Actually now organisations started to see the benefit of investing in staff via the apprenticeship levy.
I think there's, I agree with that. I think there are different nuances in different sectors. The construction sector was quite late to changing from the old SACE to the new standards, and has now started to see the benefit in terms of quality. So in certain sectors, I think there's been a sort of a slow but easier transition, and in others it has been a case of, I just need to work out for the finance director how to get the money back. But I think that is maturing, and people are now starting to say, actually, I can get some benefit from the business from the levy. I just need to think about that in the slightly longer term and start to improve my workforce planning. So I wouldn't be an advocate of wholesale change. However, there are some points of detail which I think we can all start to recognise, and let's just improve the levy by making some changes to it. And as somebody that's been through an apprenticeship, in many businesses, it's essential you can move between employers. Otherwise, you can't get the skills necessary for the whole rounded apprenticeship. And we've only got that in construction and digital now, and it's difficult to move. So I think there's a whole raft of things that could improve the levy, and we should focus on those, as well as some of the other recommendations that are in the report that are outside of apprenticeships, because we've got to upskill the workforce. And if you're 30 or 40, you might go on a short course to learn about green skills and digitization. You won't want to go and do an apprenticeship necessarily. And that other type of learning, that career pathway, I believe is essential, as well as apprenticeships.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's obviously very pertinent now as the skills bill is approved, and we're looking quite closely as well at the lifelong loan entitlement and what that's going to mean for lifelong training, and of course kind of short modularized courses, which you're sort of hinting at there, Graham, the ability as an older worker to go and retrain in something quite sort of specific and targeted. I was wondering actually what you thought about the potential pitfalls of that policy, and whether the sort of employer-driven, the question of following employer sort of needs might be sort of passed on across to the lifelong loan entitlement, which is obviously quite a kind of market-oriented, learner demand-driven sort of approach to skills policy. How do you think that and potentially other elements of the government's skills strategy fits in with the analysis of apprenticeships that we've discussed today?
Can I maybe sort of kick us off on that? So I think one of the challenges, as Graham was saying before, actually, is we don't actually have a skills strategy. What we have is a collection of policies, and actually, what are we trying to achieve, and how do they fit together? I mean, you can't come up with one grand plan that solves all things, but it'd be nice to have a general sense of what we're trying to achieve. I guess the other sort of linked point is, so I remember when I was working on skills policy in government, and one of the things we were looking at was sector skills councils. Our general view was that a third of them were brilliant, and a third of them were all right, and a third of them weren't that great. I think it might have been John Hayes who later went on to become the skills minister. I think he argued that the best ones had started life as medieval guilds. And I guess my view is we haven't got long enough to wait for the rest to sort of to catch up with that. So I think there is a kind of sectoral point here, in that some sectors kind of have a tradition and history of this and investing in their workforces, and kind of, we could probably all name the engineering companies, for example. Bavina definitely can, given the sectors you're covering. But other sectors less so. So if you ask that some of the lower productivity sectors to come up with what are your skills needs, a lot of them are probably going to say, well, do you know what, we're fine broadly. Or so I think there is a longer term view here that gets missed if you just get a group of current employers around a table to say, what do you need? They probably know what they need now and maybe even 3 years time, but what does net zero look like in the 2040s? Don't know. So I think there is It needs to be about more than asking employers, what do you need? That's true of all policy. And we need to think for those sectors where there isn't that sort of history and tradition of coming together in that way, how do we do it? The government's answer is, we'll ask some chambers of commerce to draw up some local skills improvement plans, and then the colleges, I think, primarily are going to have to say every year how they've met them. This is kind of quite a sort of planning driven approach, I think, and I'm not sure that the plans are going to sort of give us what we need in 30 years time. I'm not sure they're representative of all employers, and I'm not sure how we're actually going to judge or incentivise or support the skills system to meet those plans. So I would say the lifelong learning entitlement is a great policy. We need more of that. But actually, for more people to do level 4 and above, we need more people to do basic skills level 2 and level 3. And we're building a ladder of opportunity without the bottom rungs, which makes a ladder broadly useless. So we kind of need more around it. And we need to think what we need for the longer term as a country, as well as what specific employers need individually today. So that's kind of why, you know, I'm always loath to call for strategies, because, you know, we can write strategies all day. But do you think we need that bigger picture about how things fit together?
If I could jump in at this point, the two things I just wanted to add is, I think some of this fits back to the scrapping of the industrial strategy, and that gave us a slight overarching narrative of what we're trying to aim for as a country. Now, again, I agree with you, Stephen, that you can't put everything on paper and have this nice, shiny guiding light, but it gave us something to work towards. And I think, I can't believe I'm saying this word again, but post-Brexit, what is our economy working towards? What are we building? What are our advantages? And then how do we gear our skill system towards that? And I don't think that's quite clear. We've sort of got the opportunity now, and I think local skills improvement plans working with businesses is really good. The one thing I would flag, and it probably comes really strange me saying it as a trade association, but what we don't want to do is go so far the other way that it's just driven by businesses and what employers need. Sometimes the beauty about learning is that you're learning just for enjoyment. And things like Skillshare, YouTube, Google Classes, all of those things have encouraged that. And we've seen that change in the pandemic. So educational providers have a really important role in connecting people with opportunities. And I think swinging too far the other way and making it purely employer driven is not the approach. And also, every business I will speak to will say, I've got businesses to run. I will not have the time to be able to do all of these things.
Charlotte, you were jumping.
That's okay. Yeah, I suppose we also have to be careful how we define training to employers, and it builds on that completely employer-led training system. There are a number of training courses that every organisation will deliver, such as first aid, cyberbullying, etc., and potentially we're in danger of all the money being spent on the things that a business would spend money on anyway. So how do we make sure that it's really defined about that skill, upskilling, and being about the individual as well? And I think if it was completely given to employers, a lot of the training, if it wasn't properly defined, could be spent on things that they'd be spending money on anyway, rather than upskilling and kind of aiming for that wider agenda we're trying to get.
Yeah, I think we need some form of national strategy. I think I agree with the speakers. We've got to know where we're going, and therefore how are we going to get there. And I think we have to recognize that we need a degree of flexibility. If you're going to be simplistic, you can take an occupation, doesn't matter what it is, brain surgeon, nurse, chef, or whatever, and you can break that down into components of things people need to know and competencies they need to be able to demonstrate. And a lot of people that are in the workforce may be able to demonstrate 70% of those competencies and knowledge. But as digitization comes along and green skills comes along, they need to be upskilled. They need some new learning. And we therefore, and it doesn't matter which sector we're talking about, we need therefore the ability to be able to define those areas that are going to change all the time, perhaps every 6 months, some of them, if you're talking about digitization, or are going to change over a number of years, like green skills and net zero, and to be able to upskill our workforce. And our current set of policies just don't do that at all. We've rammed ourselves into a box of here's an apprenticeship standard. You try and work out what within that apprenticeship standard you've got to break out for net zero or break out for digitization, and you cannot. It's not there. It's because we've started with this view of we're taking a young person, we're going to put them through this 2 years, 3 years, whatever it happens to be, and it's a complete course, or it's an FE course, or it's a university course, and it's fixed. And of course, that's just not going to work for the rest of the workforce and upskilling. And it doesn't work for increasing accessibility. It doesn't work for social mobility and leveling up. And we've got to rethink the way we do it. I don't want to fundamentally throw everything away, but I think we do need to start to break back into the apprenticeship standards and the HTQs. We're approved for HTQs, and they're just a course that a young person goes on. Nobody's thought through conceptually how they're going to be able to break those HTQs down to actually use them for upskilling of the workforce. So we just need a bit of fundamental conceptual rethink.
I mean, do we think that there's a scope then, the lifelong loan entitlement is quite focused on in individual workers being able to access loan funding to, access these kind of short courses. Should we be talking about this being part of the apprenticeship levy? And if that's the case, what kind of what are the boundaries of flexibility that we might want to introduce in that sort of rethink of the levy? Because one of the sort of core problems I often find when talking about this is it's either too flexible or not flexible enough. What are the kind of bounds of what we should be talking about in terms of the choices that employers can make and what they can spend money on?
Shall I make the case that we made in the report, and then
yeah,
I just about to do that as well, Stephen.
Yeah. So actually, there is this tension between, if you're going to give complete flexibility, then what's the point of having a levy at all? Versus we're very constrained, and therefore, kind of employers can't get what they want. So there's a kind of happy middle somewhere, the Goldilocks solution. My argument would be that we should allow accredited qualifications to be funded up to level 3 potentially, and maybe you stop thereafter, or maybe you go on to level 4 and 5 to be funded from the levy. The quid pro quo of that is that's going to eat up more of the levy for large firms. So to avoid having nothing left for the SMEs, you need to get more employers paying the levy, increase public spending, or increase the contribution rates to the levy. So it needs to be a something for something deal that's done collaboratively with employers and trade unions, rather than the Treasury sort of turning up in October, November and saying, "Ta-da, we're going to do this thing, best of luck to everyone," and then everyone will get annoyed. That's not the approach we have in general to policy making. It's not a sort of collaborative thing, and officials get very worried about ideas being leaked and secret Treasury plans to do X, Y and Z, or Treasury looking at this thing that one official mentioned once in a meeting or something. So I kind of understand the concern, but it's not very helpful to policy making. I guess what I would particularly, so the super skills tax credit we talked about in the report, we particularly wanted to focus on essential skills like literacy and numeracy. So before you get up to level 4 and 5, for example, there are 9 million adults in England with low literacy or numeracy, 13 million, I think, with low digital skills. And the number of adults improving those skills each year has fallen 63% since 2010. So we've gone backwards from a low base. This is disastrous and holds back everything else. You can't do the rest of it unless you've got that core of literacy, numeracy, digital, I think, and other basic skills. So that we want a real focus on that, where we've lost our sights as a country. One of my worries, we need to be a country where we can do more than one thing at once. So yes, we want more people to do level 3, 4, 5 in particular. We definitely need that. But we also need more people to do essential skills and level 2. And actually, 1 is required for the other one, because you need people there to progress up. We need to be able to do 2 things at once, rather than just focusing on that level 3 plus, because it will definitely fail, because there's not enough people ready to go up there. So that's my argument. Flex it up for accredited qualifications, particularly to level 3, maybe 4, 5 as well, but have that real push on that entry level and the first rungs of the ladder.
I think that takes me to the point about the national skills strategy, because you need to look at all of the components, don't you? The entry level, the level 1, the level 2, the level 3, the level 4, the level 5, and we do seem to have policy that's been a silver bullet. For a few years, the silver bullet was apprenticeships, and now the silver bullet is T levels. But actually, we need initiatives that work and are sensibly funded right the way across the piece, and that's the bit that's missing, isn't it? That view that we need quite a broad range of initiatives to support skills across all sectors, all levels, yeah, and work out what's the best way of funding each of those, so it produces the right behaviour amongst the employers and the learners. Yes, because the levy does at times produce negative behaviours, doesn't always produce positive. So it's thinking through, what will employer do if we do that? Yes, so I think we need that in a national strategy discussion. Try and work out how the whole lot works, and we don't seem to be anywhere near having that conversation.
On the question of basic skills, I mean, I think this is something that really, it comes through again and again, and there's, apart from sort of multiply, there's been a bit of funding on that, but it frankly is sort of looking to fall short of what's needed, really. But from an employer perspective, I mean, what's the role of business there when it comes to basic skills, and how can employers kind of really shift the dial on that?
Shall I start with this? Yeah. And then Ravina, I can see, wants to come in as well. It's been really interesting to see this from a behavioural perspective, and this is where I mentioned, how do we support the right culture, which isn't always about the easiest route of skilling an individual. So there are some employers who have actually, and providers actually, who have built in that having the level 2 functional skills, maths and English, is a prerequisite for them taking that individual on as an apprentice. And that is just because it is a lot of hard work, and the funding isn't necessarily at the right level to encourage employers to wish to take that on as an additional responsibility. I think they're also scared of it. It's a scary thing if you're not from that world to try and make sure somebody is upskilled to that level. So I think it's an area where there's a lot more we can do. Literacy and numeracy, as Stephen's mentioned, is massively important. But for example, T levels, that's now been taken out of that as a requirement. So apprenticeships is really the only place where having level 2 maths and English is seen as a responsibility of the employer. But the employer is scared of it, and it's additional effort when you could potentially take on somebody who has already achieved that. So there is more I think we need to do on that piece to ensure that it's not always about the easiest route, but how do we support that equity, access and participation as well, whatever this looks like.
And the one thing I'd add to what Charlotte said, because I completely agree with that, is an increasing number of employers looking at digital skills now. So do you have that basic level of digital skills? Now, actually, for Generation Z who are coming into the workforce now, they tend to have that. In fact, they're probably too good at it. And actually, we're making the most of that by doing reverse mentoring, where they can then teach older people in the workforce where their skills might not be as good, to teach them how to do those kind of things that we would maybe think is simple, or they would think is simple, but using them as an opportunity to teach the slightly older workforce. But digital numeracy and literacy skills are that holy trinity, really, and you'll need that in whatever job you do. Graham's mentioned digitalization and the pace at which that is changing, especially in our sector. If we think about businesses who are re-gearing their entire operations to become net zero, a crucial part of that is using technology. And they are looking for people who can code, who do computer science, all of those things, skills that you wouldn't traditionally think you need in the manufacturing sector, but there's a huge demand. So there is, by cracking that kind of level 2, making sure that holy trinity of skills is there, you can also encourage a whole host of other people to explore different sectors and industries, which is what we hope we can do, so that you can move and jump about and find what really works for you, rather than kind of just staying in one particular sector.
I'm going to move on for a moment to some of the questions that we've got from the audience, and just sort of following on from your response there, Bhavina, sort of looking at the manufacturing sector as a whole. If there were more kind of flexibility in a levy, if it worked more kind of broadly as a skills levy, how would you sort of see that playing out across manufacturing? And perhaps, Graham, you might want to come in afterwards, you from a construction perspective, or
the flexibilities that we often hear from manufacturers that they want are around using existing levy funds to spend on things like capital equipment. So often your local college or your education provider might not necessarily have the most up-to-date equipment, and that's fair enough. You know, funding for those education providers has been falling year on year, but businesses want to make sure that young people are using the equipment that they would then use when they go into business. So often they look at something like the apprenticeship levy, they see their unused levy funds and think, if I could use that, for example, to subsidize some of the funding for capital equipment, that might help make sure that young people are using the things that they need. The second thing, and Treasury officials will hate me for saying this, but we always push for it, is actually, is there a way we can use it for wages? Now that becomes quite difficult because there will be an entire argument about, is it value for money? How do you track if it's being used effectively? All of those arguments. But we really made that case, particularly during the pandemic, where young people were, those on doing apprenticeships were sometimes made redundant because there were businesses who just couldn't afford to pay all these wages. So, but they had levy funds that were leaving their account. So it's probably not a situation we're in right now, but those were the two flexibilities that we called for. In terms of making it a skills tax credit, I think it's certainly worth exploring, but as Stephen mentioned, we would have to increase how much we would be asking employers to pay into the system because it just wouldn't be financially sustainable. I think the NAO's report in 2019 flagged this, and making sure that part of that is ring fence for young people is really crucial. And again, I think this was mentioned in the report, that we don't want to lose that pot of funding and find it going on all sorts of different training. Apprenticeships fundamentally, I believe, and our sector believes, is for young people to get into the workforce. Now, we can argue about the definition, but that's how we see it. And so we would want to make sure that it is protected for them.
Graham, do you have any thoughts?
Yes,
on
I do. I reiterate the points about capital equipment, and I would even include the training of tutors, because digitization is having such an impact in all sectors, and construction, engineering, manufacturing. There's lots of synergies between them. A couple of other things that have come out within the sector are paying travel for the apprentice to be able to get to sites to go and do some of the work. Some of that sort of, I know that sounds fairly basic, but actually that has been a restriction in that people would like to see. There, as time has gone on since the apprenticeship standards were written, and that they're written in a certain way, industry started to ask for sort of extra add-on skills, which are now not fundable in the apprenticeship, but they're a logical sort of small piece of learning to add on that's necessary. So they'd like to see that type of flexibility built into the process as well. And upskilling. Most of the construction apprenticeships are at level 2, other than carpentry, that does allow you to go on to level 3. And if we are to manage a progression up to level 3, I think a lot of employers are going, well, how's that going to get funded out the levy then? Because we've got a level 2 apprenticeship, we haven't got a level 3 top up in virtually all of the occupations. So a couple of other sort of slightly different, but there's some common issues between the two major sectors.
Stephen.
Yeah, but if I maybe just challenge back slightly on Graham and Bhavina's suggestions, or some of them. Some of them I think is eminently sensible. I think if you allow all of those things, then what you find is the cost per apprentice is massively higher than it is now, which means that either you get fewer apprentices out of the same total levy, and more spend per person, I suppose, within an employer, or you have to sort of find some more money somewhere. So this is why I think sort of some flexibilities. Well, I've talked about the flexibilities I would put in there, and that's got to be part of a quid pro quo of raising more money from somewhere, which means employers contributing more or more employers contributing, I would argue, but that needs to be a deal. I guess the other thing is looking at what would happen in the absence of a levy. So I would argue, let's say the apprenticeship levy doesn't exist, and there was a time it didn't exist like 5 years ago, would some of those employers would still be doing some of that training, would have to pay for their workers to get to their sites anyway. So that's kind of, again, this is maybe the former Treasury official in me coming out a little bit, but I think we do have to be, you know, are we talking about this is all spend on skills, in which case it's got to raise some more money, or are there some limits and we expect employers to do some more beyond that? But that's why it needs to also be a joint discussion, I think, between employer groups, trade unions, and the Treasury to work that through, rather than everyone's got their own personal opinion and then the Treasury does something, which is kind of what it feels like at the moment.
I suppose I'll pick up, because construction has had a levy since 1965, and its levy has been far more flexible, but it's gone all the way down to SMEs, yes, and has been higher than the current levy. So I think that's an interesting debate. I totally agree with you. Yes, unless you flex the levy in different, if you want flexibility in terms of what's included in it, you've got to start looking at about how big the pot is, what is the levy payment, how many employers are involved. You can't do one without the other, otherwise you'll just reduce the number of apprentices even less than they are now. Yeah.
Stephen, can I put in a different perspective? So arguably, the cost per apprentice is quite expensive, because we've got 50% not completing. And 50% drop in success rate. So is there a different discussion around how we incentivize, whether that be financially or otherwise, people to complete their apprenticeship?
Yeah. Well, Bhavina talks about this being the silent crisis, I think was the phrase earlier on. I think the last but one skills minister said they were going to look at what was going on in terms of apprenticeship completions. I'm not sure what they found, if anything, but we definitely need to look at that. I guess my question is, what's the issue here, and are changing financial incentives going to be part of helping tackle that? I do agree we need to have a look at it. It also, I think some of this gets into a point which I think Bhavina was alluding to earlier, which is what is the levy for? So some of the employers we've spoken to, and maybe this, as Graham and Bhavina suggested, has changed in the last year or so, but they see it as it's become the training budget, and so that's why they want to get their money back. And actually, if every large firm got their money back, it'd be a disaster, because we'd have no money left for SMEs. The whole thing is set up so that large firms only spend 2/3 of their levy, and it's not their training budget. They're meant to do more on top of that. But this is the kind of messaging point, because it's not really seen in that way. So we need a much clearer deal overall, I would argue, about what this thing's for and how we set the limits.
And I would just throw in there that we do have a levelling up fund. Now, one of the missions is, skills focus. So going back to a point that was raised in the chat, and somebody posed this question, is what's that kind of working across government looking like? Because what role have BEIS got in this? DFE, the new levelling up task force, levelling up directors that we're supposed to see. And it's that connection between all of them, because you could argue that funding for things like travel shouldn't come from the levy. It comes from something like a levelling up fund, a pot of money that you put an application for, that you can help your apprentice get across Liverpool to access their training. But I appreciate that creates a whole host of problems as well. But I think it feeds nicely into the levelling up agenda, and why we've always said that is right. We need to be thinking about these things, because there's a whole ecosystem behind why people can't access opportunities. And often it's not because your education provider isn't delivering it, or your employer isn't offering it. It's because I can't get to the place I need to get to, or there's some other kind of barrier. So it's a really complicated picture. But again, going back to my other point, there are other pots of funding out there that we could potentially use. But like Graham said, if it's a more connected ecosystem, and maybe I'm thinking about some utopia that will never exist, that seems like a sensible way to try and crack a problem that we've been talking about for years now.
Yeah, I think if we had some sort of national framework and strategy, we'd know, okay, so the levy's going to pay for that, the levelling up's going to pay for that, and somebody else is going to pay for the travel, but we can all understand how it works. And I just don't think we're anywhere near that. Yeah, it's just not joined up enough.
One of the really popular questions posed during the session has been how we might encourage the Treasury to be more transparent about where the unspent levy goes. Have you got any thoughts on that, or perhaps the broader messaging around the unspent levy that might kind of improve the system? Stephen,
I don't really understand why. I mean, it's the DFE as well as the Treasury. I think I don't really understand why they aren't. Well, I feel like I have to do more FOI requests than I really wanted to be honest. But I'll keep doing them. But it kind of it feels like this is part of, if you said at the start, this is what we're trying to achieve with this policy, and then we'll kind of know whether we've achieved it or not, and then you sort of publish some data along the way. That kind of feels fairly. In fact, there's a whole episode of Yes Minister, which is still remarkably apposite, explaining why that doesn't happen, or why everyone's in favour of it for other departments. But I do think it's fairly basic stuff. You know, what is this vast amount of public money getting spent on, and do we think it's kind of the right sort of thing or not? On a very micro level, this is a personal bugbear. The DFE's statistics website is diabolically awful. It's kind of either just terribly designed or deliberately terribly designed so no one can find any figures. But I think there is a big thing about, going back to the digitisation point, about data. And the Cameron government came in, said open data, sunlight's the best disinfectant, all this sort of stuff. I do think we need far more of that. There are some of these things starting to get a bit more open, like the data that links participation in learning with your HMRC data on your earnings and job prospects, and that's getting a bit more open now. But there's just so much further we can go, and it feels to me like it's the public's data because it's the public's money. How do we persuade them to do it? I mean, some of this maybe this is a job for a select committee to say, well, we're going to sort of ask for this data regularly so we can kind of sort of be clear about it. Maybe it's the Treasury. We used to have public spending agreements and targets and things like that, and then they went a bit out of vogue. But maybe we need, we've got levelling up missions now, haven't we, which is sort of public sector agreements, sort of. So maybe it's that kind of setting that ambition up front, and then you kind of have regular reporting. We've got more devolution now, not of the apprenticeship levy, but of the skills system. So maybe any metro mayors on the event would like to commit to publishing a bit more data more openly. I think there are kind of ways in, and it feels like in a digital world where there's so much data around, it really should be much more transparent.
I could just add as well, my ask is that the NAO carries out their assessment of the apprenticeship levy and whether that's demonstrating value for money, because we've had the pandemic, things have really changed. And if anyone can get data out of DFE, it's the National Audit Office, and I'm sure that would go to PAC. So that's, I think, definitely something to consider. And the only thing else I would add is that we've got the new Future Skills Unit that's been set up. It's not UK CES, fine, you know, we're not there yet, and I don't think they're going to involve it into that. But the Future Skills Unit might be able to operate, if we all kind of collectively agree and push for this, to operate like the MAC, where they have to report, where they take those recommendations. But that is quite a, that's an ambition level here. And I'm not sure it's going to happen, but we can call for it.
I think I'd like to see an open discussion on what to do with the underspends. If the levy is underspent, do we need to put it aside as a provision because we know there's trouble down next year, we're going to be overspent? That's one thing. Or do we now say, well, let's invest because we know new technologies coming, greening, let's actually put some money into capital investment or investment into the infrastructure of delivering training. But that we just don't seem to have that transparency of discussion. And I think it would be healthy if we could have that transparency. It just disappears into the pot. I suppose it keeps down the overall borrowing requirement. But perhaps we should be talking about, can't we use it to reinvest in a sensible way for the future?
We've only got about 5 minutes left of the session, so I'm going to move to another very popular question, which I think will be a good one to end on. What are the key changes that employers want to see in order to sort of drive re-engagement with the levy, but also the sort of the right kind of engagement? And I think along with that question, I'd add sort of retention and completion as well. What do you think? You can treat that as your sort of final concluding comments as well, if you like.
Shall I come in first?
Yeah, please.
So I think it depends what employer you're asking that question. I think if you're speaking to large levy paying employers, the answer would be very different, but it is our SME community I think we need to think about, focus on when we're asking what their needs are. You know, they're the individuals at this moment who are taking on less apprentices, and we're possibly forgetting in some of this debate and argument at the moment. So I think it is as thinking around how actually can we really support that 99% of the workforce, which are SMEs, to engage in having a more skilled workforce, and how do we actively support that financially within this process. And that just seems to be the forgotten piece that definitely needs to feed more into the overall debate at the moment.
I agree with you, Charlotte, and I think part of that debate then is how do we make the bureaucracy more simple? A couple of 100 pages of funding rules is definitely in the too hard box, as you will know, for all SMEs, and a bit more flexibility, because SMEs can't necessarily deliver the full range of things, but nevertheless can produce a good operative or a good chef or whatever, but maybe they can't do quite everything, and it's that sort of level of flexibility as well.
I had three specific ones. So the first one I mentioned, allowing employers to use it for capital equipment. That would be the first. The second is then to maybe consider increasing the amount that larger employers can transfer to smaller SMEs, smaller companies. I know that's been increased before, but if there's still unused levy funds, it makes sense that they can transfer more of that. And then the third thing is the call to have the NAO to undertake a review. And at that point, all options need to be on the table. We should consider something like a skills training tax.
Shall I maybe? I'll stick with two. Although each one may incorporate several elements. But I think my two would be: one is a bit more flex in the levy system along the ways that I've described anyway, and others will have slightly different views. But that's a quid pro quo. That's a deal. That's a something for something deal, where more employers are involved in the system and paying into it. So I think you have to put the two halves together, which means it needs to be done collaboratively. But secondly, you know, just thinking about the access and levelling up points, and that others have mentioned, one of the things we argued for in a previous report was an apprentice premium in the system. So a bit like the pupil premium. And so if you've got apprentices from particular backgrounds or particular parts of the country, or if you're Andy Burnham, you might set particular sectors that you want to prioritise. You have a sort of bit of a top up in the system to help with some of those recruitment issues or travel issues or whatever it happens to be. So I guess they flex up the levy with more businesses involved and paying more into it. And then secondly, that sort of apprentice premium type system to get the help where it's most needed and level up opportunity.
Thanks very much. I think as the suggestions show, it's not an intractable problem as it can sometimes feel, particularly when looking at your excellent charts, Stephen. And I mean, I think that the takeaway from lots of that is that it's possible to make change without necessarily more policy churn. So I mean, hopefully that could be coming down the line, although not fully convinced quite yet. That's all for today. Thanks very much to everyone who attended, to NOCN for their support, and all our excellent panelists. before you leave the event, you can feedback via a survey, which I think will probably just sort of have appeared on your screens now. So yeah, would really appreciate if you're able to do that. Thanks very much for coming along, and we'll follow up for all attendees with a link to the recording and the report as well. So yeah, hope to see you all again soon, and thanks very much for everyone who attended.